The April Uprising of 1989 was not merely a protest against rising prices, nor a passing disturbance on the country's margins. It was a historic moment of eruption, the breaking point of a reality long governed by denial and marginalization, and a truthful mirror reflecting the fragility of the social contract imposed on the peripheries in the name of national unity. When Prime Minister Zayed al-Rifai's government, under pressure from the IMF, decided to raise prices, the decision was nothing more than the spark that ignited a fire fueled by years of structural injustice and political and geographic exclusion, especially in the southern cities of Ma'an, Tafileh, and Ruseifa. Yet more important than the events themselves was what came afterward: media blackout, deliberate erasure from official memory, and a systematic silencing of the street's voice. The story was always told from one side, while the rebellious cities were turned into gray zones spoken of in hushed tones, as if they were merely scenes of chaos without demands. In this video, we won't just retell what happened. We'll uncover how the state tried to contain memory through repression, and how the South defied that with fire and words. We'll revisit the first moments of the explosion, break down its causes, document what unfolded on the ground, and trace its consequences up to the present day. So stay with us till the end. And don't forget to support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel to stay updated with our latest content. During the 1970s, Jordan experienced what appeared to be an economic boom, driven by remittances from Jordanian workers in the Gulf, Arab financial aid, and an unrestrained expansion of foreign borrowing. However, this growth was not based on a sustainable productive foundation. It was fueled by temporary financial inflows. The bulk of these resources were directed toward the service and financial sectors, while agriculture and industry were neglected, creating deep structural imbalances in the Jordanian economy. This imbalance became increasingly visible as the contribution of the labor force in productive sectors declined, dependence on imports grew, and excessive consumption spread amid the absence of policies promoting self-sufficiency. Meanwhile, the capital, Amman, monopolized most state institutions, services, and infrastructure, while other provinces, particularly Ma'an and Tafileh, continued to suffer from marginalization, poverty, and high unemployment. This deepened the sense of political and social detachment between the center and the periphery. Such developmental disparity created a kind of internal divide within the state, where economic opportunities and decision-making were concentrated in the capital, while the outer regions endured inflation and a sharp decline in purchasing power. Between 1972 and 1985, the prices of basic goods rose rapidly, eroding real incomes, especially among poorer segments in the South. By the late 1980s, as the economic crisis intensified and foreign aid declined, the government turned to the economic adjustment programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund. Under Prime Minister Zayed al-Rifai's leadership, the government decided in April 1989 to raise the prices of fuel and basic commodities by up to 50%, including gasoline, diesel, gas, food items, and even licensing fees. This decision became the true spark that ignited the wave of popular anger in Ma'an, which later spread to Tafileh and Ruseifa. The spark of the April 1989 uprising ignited in the city of Ma'an on the morning of April 17th, when taxi drivers went on strike to protest a government decision to raise fuel prices without adjusting transport fares. What began as a limited professional action quickly transformed into a full-scale popular uprising, as students and citizens joined the protests, and massive crowds flooded the streets in an unprecedented wave of anger. Clashes escalated rapidly. Demonstrators confronted security forces, police vehicles and fuel stations were set ablaze, and casualties were recorded on both sides. As the unrest spread and security forces failed to contain it, the state deployed the army, which entered Mayan on April 21st and imposed a full curfew. According to local reports, more than 500 people, mostly young men, were arrested and transferred to detention centers outside the city, most notably the Yafur prison. Mayan's protests were not only about prices. They reflected a southern rejection of political and economic marginalization in a city long known for being the first to raise its voice against central authority. Thus, Mayan cemented its reputation as a lasting symbol of popular dissent. The wave of protests soon expanded to the city of Tafile, where hundreds of residents from areas such as Al-Hassa, Busaira, Al-Aiz, and Jurf al-Darawish took to the streets in anger. Despite the province's rural nature, the scale and intensity of the 1989 Tafile demonstrations revealed a clear political stance against government policies, particularly price hikes and the continuation of martial law. Authorities responded harshly. Official buildings, including bank branches and government offices, were set on fire. Notably, public statements were issued by tribal leaders and elders, especially from the Bani Sakar tribe, explicitly calling for the abolition of martial law and the release of detainees. Trade unions, writers, and intellectuals later joined in, giving the movement an institutional political character, rather than merely a socio-economic protest. In Rusaifa, located geographically between Amman and Zarqa, silent but intense protests erupted simultaneously with those in the south. Although the 1989 Rusaifa demonstrations received little fair media coverage, local accounts describe clashes with security forces, chases through alleyways, and dozens of arrests, mostly of young people. Due to its proximity to the capital, the city was placed under tight media control. Images and footage were suppressed, and its name was omitted from official statements. Yet those who lived through those moments affirmed that anger was palpable, and the feeling of marginalization was no less severe than in other provinces. The April 1989 uprising led to a swift and unprecedented political shift within the structure of Jordan's ruling system. Less than a week after the protests began, King Hussein was forced to accept the resignation of Prime Minister Zaid al-Rifai's government on April 23, 1989, holding it responsible for the price hike decision and the broader policies of impoverishment. Zaid bin Shaker was then tasked with forming a new government in an attempt to contain the crisis, calm public anger, and present a more open political front. However, this cabinet was short-lived. It was soon followed by the formation of Mudar Badran's government, which marked a turning point as it oversaw the entry of Islamists into parliament for the first time in decades, signaling a limited political opening toward the broader national spectrum. In November of the same year, Jordan held its 1989 parliamentary elections, the first free elections since 1967, laying the groundwork for what was seen at the time as the beginning of Jordan's democratic transformation. These elections revived parliamentary life after a long suspension and included participation from previously marginalized or excluded groups, including the Islamic movement, which won a significant number of seats. Yet despite the symbolic momentum of this shift, it remained fragile, as it was not accompanied by substantial economic or social reforms. Nevertheless, that period represented a defining moment in the relationship between the state and the street, revealing, for the first time, that public pressure could indeed bring about real political change. Although the April 1989 uprising represented a pivotal moment in Jordan's political and social history, media coverage at the time failed to reflect the magnitude of the events. Official reporting was limited to brief government statements broadcast on Jordanian television without any visual documentation or genuine field coverage. At the height of the protests that swept through the southern cities, especially Ma'an and Tafileh, no images were published, no video recordings aired, and no newspaper space was devoted to reporting from the ground. This created a gap between what was actually happening in the streets and what the public was allowed to know. This media blackout, whether deliberate or the result of institutional restrictions, contributed to obscuring many details of what took place. No official archive or file containing records of the 1989 uprising was ever opened, and the events remained preserved only in the memories of eyewitnesses and in scattered, unstructured oral accounts. As a result, researchers later struggled to construct a reliable narrative from within the events themselves. Over time, video clips began surfacing online and on social media, documenting later demonstrations in Ma'an and Tafileh, evidence that popular mobilization in the South persisted. These videos became an alternative visual archive to the absent official record and gradually formed part of Ma'an's collective memory, preserving a story that was never meant to be told. Despite the limited scope of these individual initiatives, they help fill a dangerous historical void and restore recognition to what official media once tried to marginalize. With institutional documentation still lacking, a moral and social responsibility remains to collect and preserve testimonies from those who lived through the uprising, as they are an indispensable source for understanding the Ma'an uprising video and for rewriting the narrative of southern Jordan away from the biases of the political center. Although the immediate spark of the April 1989 uprising was the government's decision to raise fuel prices, the deeper content of the protests went far beyond a temporary economic grievance. The uprising was, in essence, an explicit expression of a complex crisis that touched the very foundations of Jordan's economic, social, and political system. A manifestation of the widening gap between the center and the periphery, between privileged elites and marginalized communities. What stood out in that uprising was that the street, especially in the southern cities of Ma'an and Tafileh, did not limit its demands to lowering prices. Protesters raised clearly political slogans, calling for the resignation of the government, accountability for corruption, the abolition of martial law, and the opening of space for political parties and organized political activity. These demands reflected a qualitative shift in public consciousness as citizens began linking poverty and marginalization to political exclusion, lack of justice, and deteriorating living conditions. Contrary to the official narrative that sought to portray the uprising as mere riots over prices, the events revealed that the public understood these economic decisions were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader political and economic approach that systematically reproduced inequality and exclusion. Thus, the uprising, through its slogans and demands, marked a turning point in popular discourse and the emergence of a social opposition movement with structural, not circumstantial, demands. It also revealed what could be described as a regional class consciousness, as the southern provinces expressed their rejection of what they saw as political and economic exploitation by the central authority. This awareness transformed the uprising from a protest against an economic decision into a genuine act of resistance against a biased, centralized administrative system. In the end, the causes of the April uprising were not merely about living conditions, but about political stagnation and a deep imbalance in the distribution of power and wealth within the Jordanian state. After the political flame of the April 1989 uprising had faded, its underlying causes never truly disappeared. especially in Mayan, which had effectively become a symbol of resistance in southern Jordan. Instead of turning that moment into a real opportunity to address the roots of public anger, the state continued to treat the city as a security case, not as a part of the homeland deserving of development, justice, and genuine participation. In 1996, protests resurfaced after the government approved a new increase in bread prices, sparking a series of violent confrontations in Mayan that later spread to other provinces. It became clear that since 1989, little had changed beyond the surface. The structural problems, such as the lack of development in Jordan and the continued marginalization of the South, remained unresolved. Although the state promised relief measures at the time, those promises never translated into tangible policies on the ground. By 2002, tensions erupted again in Mayan, following security pursuits of several local residents on criminal and political grounds. What began as a limited operation quickly escalated into a large-scale military confrontation in which the army used excessive force, imposing sieges and cutting off essential services. Once again, the state chose the security approach over any political or social reflection on the roots of the crisis, deepening the sense of marginalization and targeting felt across the South. In 2011, during the wave of the Arab Spring, Mayan took to the streets once more, demanding reform, jobs, and a fairer distribution of wealth. Protesters raised slogans linking official corruption to southern poverty. These were not new demands, but they reflected a new level of political awareness, especially among young people who had begun connecting their daily struggles to the state's economic choices and internal alliances. The response, however, was the same as always: arrests, official statements, and total media silence regarding what was happening in the South. By 2020, Mayan again witnessed scattered protests over poor services, rising unemployment, and the decline of education, healthcare, and freedoms. These demonstrations coincided with nationwide crises triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic, making the city's cries louder and clearer. Yet they received little media attention as the state continued to ignore voices coming from the South. Tafile, though smaller and more rural, was not far from the movement. Beyond its participation in the 1989 uprising, the city later returned to the streets in solidarity with Gaza in 2014 and 2023, raising slogans calling for dignity, freedom, and Arab solidarity. While these protests were framed as regional or humanitarian causes, they revealed an enduring political awareness and social mobilization in Tafile, despite the absence of meaningful media coverage. As for Rusaifa, despite its population size and proximity to the capital, it remained largely neglected by both the state and the media. The protests of its unemployed youth received little recognition or coverage. This neglect fits into a broader pattern: recurring protests across the South since 1996 up to 2020, all met with the same security response and no structural solutions to issues like employment, infrastructure, and resource distribution. While the political center continues to raise slogans of reform, the peripheral regions, especially the South, face the same iron-handed treatment, widening the divide between the state and its citizens. In conclusion, the April 1989 uprising was not a passing episode in Jordan's history, but a defining moment that exposed what official policies tried to conceal: the fragility of the elite, the erasure of the South, and the enduring voice of the citizen who refuses to die, even when every window is shut in his face. It was not merely the events of Mayan, Rusaifa, and Tafile, but a national cry against the chronic absence of justice and a popular narrative that refuses to be forgotten, even when the camera arrived too late to capture it. And with that, we reach the end of today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content.